Is it good morning or good afternoon?
Afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good noon.
Lovely to be here, and I see some familiar faces that are at the Open Book Festival every year. It's wonderful to be here. So my name is Leonie Joubert. I'm a science writer based here in Cape Town, and I mostly write about climate collapse, food issues, and tackling these issues from a sort of a global context. Which sounds a little unusual given the nature of the sort of niche areas where our speakers come in today, but I will set the scene, hopefully. So the context that I bring is that we are facing very serious global climate issues. We are facing the 6th mass extinction. We're seeing dangerous ecological overshoot. We're seeing our global society pushing well beyond the physical limits of what the natural environment can support. What does this have to do with connection and disconnection, as is laid out in the program? The writers Amitav Ghosh and Jeremy Lent, extraordinary writers, they trace the evolution of our more recent ideas and the evolution of a value system that has separated humans from nature. They outline how this Western colonial and very much imperial mindset, together with the sort of scientific materialism, has given us the perspective that we are above nature, we're superior to nature, and that nature is something that we can then control and dominate and exploit. And then capitalism comes along, and it's the last furnace that then forges the tool that allows us to exploit the environment to this extent, and has brought us to a point where we're at 1.2 degrees warmer than the planet should be and facing possible runaway global warming. But as these authors point out, the othering of nature that comes through from that value system, it's the same othering that we see, the othering of women, the othering of people of color, and the othering of sexualities that inhabit what many would regard as being on the margins of the cultural norm. And this othering then gives the person in power, the culture, the society in power, this idea that they can therefore exploit and extract. So it's against this backdrop that I'm delighted to introduce today's panelists. Each one of them brings their own unique perspective on our place within the society that we live in and how we engage with our surrounds, whether it's the natural environment, whether it's the urban environment, or whether it's the cultural environment. So in this conversation today, I'd like us to think about how we got to this point of disconnection, how we reconnect, and how we use that reconnection to create a more kind and equitable society. So let me introduce the speakers, and in case I forget at the end, they will be signing books down in the book venue afterwards. So Bulelwa Mabasa is a mother of 4. She's a lawyer. She works with, is it Werksmans?
It's Werksmans.
Werksmans attorneys in Joburg, where she is the head of the land reform, restitution and tenure practice. In 2018, she was appointed by President Cyril Ramaphosa to be one of his advisors, and she is the co-author of a book called Land in South Africa, Land in SA, Contested Meanings and Nation Formation. And of course, she's here to speak about her recent memoir, My Land Obsession.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chase Rhys is a Cape Townian. Chase is a novelist, a columnist, a playwright, and a screenwriter. Their latest book, Misfits, Stories van die Ander Kant, was released in July 2022. Their debut book, Kinders, won the KSL Oduiker Prize and the CakeNet Report Prize in the film category of 2019. Incidentally, Kayla and myself were chommies at varsity, so it was quite a thing to see this pop up on your... sorry, I'm digressing. Chase's column, Suikwater, is published in Rapport newspaper. And then our third panelist is Khalied Jacobs, also Cape Townian. Khalid is an urban designer. He's the director of Jacupa Architects and Urban Designers and leads the urban design team. Sometimes he sees himself as a superhero, lycra championing the cause of the underdog, but at heart he's a humanist and a negotiator who uses design process as a tool to manage disputes. So we've got very different perspectives today. Bulelwa, I'd like to start with you, please. In your memoir, you write about a moment where you're about 5 years old. You're having a conversation with your dad about a painting that has moved you. And this leads to, it informs the rest of your life. Tell us about that moment.
So, being a 5-year-old girl in Middlelands, Soweto, Zone 4, in your typical matchbox house, living with grandparents, aunts and uncles, I was intrigued by this painting, and I didn't know that it was quite common in many other households in the 80s. And this particular painting was inscribed Verna at the bottom. And I think maybe the reason I was so intrigued with this girl is because she looked like me. So she is dark-skinned, had a little bit of an afro with big eyes and teardrops with tattered clothes. So when I asked my father, I said, you know, why is she crying and why are her clothes torn? And my father's answer, he said, she is part of a generation of landless people. Her land was stolen from her. So obviously being a 5-year-old, you don't think of it in any manner of complexity or even national interest. You just think, that's unfair, you know, why? So that was, I think, my first subconscious and even conscious interaction with dispossession. And it's interesting that it was through a painting. It wasn't my lived experience, but as life happened and as I listened to my grandparents bemoan the day that the Caspers arrived in Sophia Town, when they were a young couple with 2 children, being forcibly removed to then Middlelands, then that's what kind of connected me with the fact that, oh, so I was born in a township of Middlelands that was actually the first fruit, for lack of a better word, of the Group Areas Act. And so that kind of dispossession, or even the narrative around land dispossession, was something that I felt I was born into. And that also then informed my first experience with difference or othering when I attended a netball match when I was still in a school in the township, and I attended a netball match and I was in a suburb. For the first time in my life, I didn't know that there was anything wrong with being born in Zone 4 Middlelands until I accessed suburbia and until I realized the disparity on the air is clean, the birds are singing here, there's so much vastness and space, and there are trees and tennis courts and swimming pools. And so I think that framing during my formative years, then all of that is what catapulted me into this curiosity that then would inhabit the rest of my life around dispossession, and in particular land dispossession.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, can I just invite them to come and take a seat?
Yes.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah, please do.
There's space
We've just
all over.
started. Yeah.
Think of this as a fireside chat. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Chase,
Yes.
what is fascinating about your book is the specific voice that it's written in, because it represents, it's written the way a certain kind of Afrikaans is spoken, and it captures a very specific, almost dialect.
Yeah.
Would you like to start by reading us a piece so that people can get a sense of the voice, and then talk us through why you chose to write in this way?
Okay, so I write in a language called Caps, And I know you asked me to do a reading, but I have
Yes.
another piece that really relates to what you just said.
What I just said.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
And so the whole book is in caps, so you'll hear the language anyway. But this piece is about these baboons. That I live in a place called Ocean View on the mountain, and we were moved there, forcibly moved there. Okay, but let me read it and you'll see the context. Okay. Met forced removals het die apartheid government ons skema op die berg gebou waar die Bobbejane roam. En soos die jare verloop het hulle die berg aanhou develop met sprawling gated estates en industrial fabrieke. Die gevolg was dat die Bobbejane nie meer toegang tot hulle natuurlike voedselbronne en waterreservoirs op die berg gehad het nie. Hulle het skiem toegekom op soek na kos. Hulle het die ou mense se drywe takke en loquatbome skoon gepluk. Die mense het die bobbies weggejaag uit Noordheid, het hulle net teruggekom. Die gemeenskap se reaksie het al hoe meer soos mob justice gelyk. Manne met pangas en dik stemme wat die hele tyd skree, daar sy, en lawaaiige kinders met klippe en swak hand-eye coordination wat gereeld Bobbejane mis en huise se ruitte raak gooi. Tot vandag toe het ek nog nooit gesien my gemeenskap so geactivate oor enige iets as anders wanneer 'n bobby van die berg afgooi. Om te verenig in 'n stryd teen 'n common enemy, wat jy weet meer vulnerable is as jy, is heeltemal lafhartig. Maar dit is mos die Suid-Afrikaanse way. So that was just about, thank you. That was just about how I live in a space where even today we still have this loquat tree in our yard, and we still have these troops of baboons coming down trying to pick out our loquats, and there's sort of this fight. And it's so interesting because we were moved there. This is their loquat tree, actually, you know. And we were moved there by the apartheid government. And the white people around us, around my community, they have these wide spaces, like you were talking about, these big, you know, what you just mentioned. And that left us to fight with these baboons, with nature. So now we are at this war with nature over a space that we used to occupy together because we had, you know, all this land. Because where we were moved from Red Hill, people on top of the hill, we're now at the bottom of the hill, but on top of the hill, we have people in Ocean View now, old, you know, grannies and grandpas talking about how they lived with these baboons, not in the house, but like with nature, and the other animals they had, and the fruit trees there, and it wasn't this fight, it's a war now in Ocean View. It's men and kids throwing stones, and we have rangers with paintball guns. It's like a proper war zone, you know? I was laying in my bed the other day, like last week, and I just saw in my window, 3 men came into my yard with like what looked like shotguns, but it's paintball guns. But just that violence, you know, on a Monday morning, Vidlis Vadai, you know? So it's, yeah, just how there's a big disconnect. There's a war. We had war with nature where I live, and it's sad because we weren't before.
So just a quick follow-on question. Why did you choose this specific voice to write in?
Oh,
I mean, it sounds like an obvious question, but...
Yes. Caps, this is, it's how we speak. This is how brown people, black people speak Afrikaans. And before it was seen as a second-class language that isn't academic or isn't worthwhile to be printed because of who speaks it. You know? And so my book, my debut book, was the first book, as far as we know, that was completely written entirely in caps, you know? Not just the dialogue, but also the narration. Every word is caps. And it's really like, it's a choice. I can write in English, I can write in traditional Afrikaans, but I'm making a choice to write in caps because we need to be represented, right? And also for our young kids to read their stories, our stories, in their own voices, literally in their own voices and how they speak. So that's why I do caps, yeah.
Yeah, lovely. This was the first time that I've ever read anything in caps like that. And immediately I heard it in my ear before I read it in my brain.
Yeah. So people are a bit like, ugh. They don't, when they first see it, because it looks different on the page to Afrikaans, but it's an auditory thing. Like you read it out loud for 2 sentences, and you'll get it, you'll hear it.
Yeah. Khalid, you tie in really nicely here because of how you view the urban landscape. We've spoken previously about District 6 and what District 6 means. It's obviously right on our doorstep. It's almost a mythological place in terms of what it tells us about, or what it represents for Cape Town and for the sort of segregated urban. Tell us a little bit about what District 6 represents for you and what the opportunities surround it in terms of trying to take a cemented apartheid city and finding some way of creating justice within that space.
Justice is hard, eh? It's tough. But I guess where I want to start with is the issue around identity and its relationship to land, I guess, which is exactly what you speak to. The interesting thing about the landscape, which obviously includes ecology, social ecology, built ecologies, that they all are layers of what we've made, and effectively becomes an archive of who we are. So the relationship between people and the making of the land is a construct. And District 6 in this way has been very, very interesting for us in understanding how it was portrayed, how it was represented, not only in the sense of when the first removals happened, because obviously the first removals, I'm sure everybody knows, happened in 1945, 46, when a set of black dock workers was removed from District 6. And that first set of removals wasn't based on the Group Areas Act. It was based on health and being safe, you know. So because the plague, etc. So therefore we remove people and shift them to Langa. But that removals, obviously, with the violence or the act of violence, is translated many times over through the course of the history of the place. First, though, in terms of the occupation. And of course, obviously, I see land in a very particular way, and I must qualify that. I see it in a spatial way, right? And control and power relations between those who occupy land and in fact all the systems, not only moving people off, but displacing ecological systems and the like. The fact we built a castle to claim land, and we used cannonballs to define the extent of what that land was, made no man's land. Yeah. And the Grand Parade is still a no man's land. The Grand Parade is part of District 6, by the way, and we're not on doorstep, we are in District 6. Yeah. This is District 6. Okay. So the relationship between settlement and land and occupation of land is not only an archive of action, but it's always a contestation between all sorts of differences. Yeah. Of course, in our case, we have an amazing talent to add layers of complexity to this equation, which includes race. Mm. But beyond that, District 6 has proven to be even more complex. And I must tell you, we find ways to make issues more complex. So this idea that District 6 is a homogeneous community is clearly a falsehood as well. Right? Mm. So there is many different stories of what District 6 is. And some of the stories is about myths. And it's great that we're in a place like this, you know, a theater, where myth gets represented sometimes, where myth and fact gets mixed. In the case of District 6, the myth of the land has multiple levels. And I just want to reference one myth. Two, if you don't mind. Okay, one being this idea of 7 steps. And we've all heard about the 7 steps of District 6, right? David Kramer and Tali Peterson's play of District 6, in my view, that's the furthest reference I could get to the idea of the 7 steps, and is represented as a place of identity and longing for. You know? Mm-hmm. So this is the place where the social life happened. And interesting enough, it gets translated into paintings, and you look at, you just Google it, you'll see all sorts of paintings representing the 7 steps and its relationship to the mountain, the views of the mountain, etc. But I managed to uncover a photograph of the 7 steps. There is no 7 steps, there are 8 steps.
Oh, wow.
And the relation, it was 8 steps to go to a lane. So you know the lanes in the old parts of a city where the sewer runs through. That is what it served, right? And so it wasn't a place. It was certainly a place of contestation, and maybe that's where the tsotsies hang out to kind of sort you out if you walk past. But the myth got translated through a play, into art, into poetry, and became something valuable. And in our conversations, of course, was, what value is that? Do we dismiss that as a thing? And of course not, because myth is important. It becomes part of that. It becomes another layer of the identity of a place. And our relationships, obviously, how it holds meaning, the place holds meaning, etc., is not only in the fact, but in how we tell our stories.
Yeah. Wow.
That's fabulous. And I guess Sophia Town is another place that is steeped in mythology. So, Bulelwa, I'd like to come back to you, because I know that the two of you are going to speak to each other around the urban and the rural land issue. But I want you to tell us briefly why you chose to write this memoir. And what does it mean to have a connection with land?
I don't think I chose to write this memoir. I think the story was so compelling that it was crying out to be told. And when I was approached by my publisher to say, write a book about, I was approached to write a book about my career as a black female who has made a success, I guess, of her life within the legal field. That was the brief. But when I started sitting down and I was writing, that was then the opportunity for what ended up being in the memoir to be told. So the story, for me, was never about me as a subject, I guess, but it was about the things that were embedded in me that were the story. So for me, the story of land is a story of, I think I was also kind of resolving a grievance by my great-grandparents and my great-grandparents and the ones that I've met and I haven't met. I think I was addressing their grievance in this memoir, in the sense of my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, as I said in the beginning, who lamented kind of, having their dreams shattered by these Caspers that arrived, and they dispossessed them of their material goods. But I think it was more about the it was less, well, the dispossession was not just about the land in its finite terms. It was about removing them from history, removing their voices, removing their sense of belonging as South Africans. And it was also me addressing my maternal grandfather's story of having been a migrant worker. And that meant that my mother was dispossessed of having a life of a father who was present. And so for me, the story about land, the way that I frame it in the book, I was deliberate about showing how the land dispossession comes out in different forms. You suddenly dispossess a family of a father figure. You dispossess a family from having feelings of triumph. You dispossess a whole generation for example, my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, who was also a mine worker, you dispossessed him of his dignity as a human being, as a man, who was then subjected to, so many other indignities of working underground and never being able to share in the wealth of the very resources that come from the very piece of land. But also you dispossess even the Mandela generation who are still stuck in townships and having to travel many kilometers just to access work. And you also dispossess people of their income because 70% of their income suddenly has to be spent on accessing economic opportunities. So you've dispossessed people of a livelihood. Mm. So I think in my memoir, what a roundabout way to answer the question. But I think in my memoir, I try to trace, using my own story and the stories of where I come from, the importance and the urgency and why that initial sin, that colonial sin of dispossession, how we then translates into othering, inequality, and continuing and persistent inequality and inequity and discrimination and othering. So it is really just, for me, what I was trying to do is to give a human face. Because I think in my professional settings, when you talk about land and land reform, it's about, it's too political. I think I wanted to bring it back to center and to humanize the story. And I think when we do that and we start giving it a human face, that's when we can start having solutions that are based on empathy and that just speaks to our human conscience.
What comes through in your book, obviously, is how much your identity is shaped by the fact that you have roots in the Transkei, which is a different scale to, for instance, what a community moved from District 6 might feel. Have you seen, Khalid, in your dealings with District 6 type communities, that there is a similar connection with an old home, a place that was called home?
Absolutely, and of course, home in this context has different meanings, of course. So all the people that we've been dealing with that currently reside in the 6/6 or work there or play there, including those who've been dispossessed or removed, rather, they all find home in the 6/6. And of course, that's where the layering of the story comes in, right? But so home, in my view, is about the affinity, the attachment, not necessarily to the house as opposed to home. An idea of home is where you belong, and this obviously plays out very clearly through the land restitution process, where people, particularly in the 6/6, or my experience with the 6/6, is that they have strong connections to the place, regardless of where they currently find themselves. Yeah. And it obviously made some kind of practical challenges in terms of accessing not only those who currently reside in the 6/6, but accessing the people who didn't live there physically, but was still their home. Yeah. So it gets a bit deep maybe for this conversation, but there's different perceptions of what that home is as well, and what it needs to be, and what it represents, etc. A quick example: the restitution process at the moment talks about giving people their houses back. But if you imagine that the home is much more than just the house, you understand that they're not getting a fair deal in this case, right? Because you have communities that have been broken up. So and you don't have public space. You don't have necessarily the same neighbors. You don't. So there's a lot in the makeup of the restitution process that doesn't provide justice and equity, which is maybe the bigger question for the attorney in the room.
Yeah.
So that issue in particular has been a missing conversation about the public realm and the role of the public, like the 7 steps, for example, in creating a sense of identity and belonging.
Which I think comes nicely to some of Chase's stories. We're showing that home is not just bricks and mortar. It's not just about having a working sewage system, running water, the drain pipes that work. It's about the social fabric. And Chase, what comes through in some of your stories is how social media allowed people to find home. There's one story of a woman who's quite heavy-set and she's self-conscious about her body, and social media liberates her. And there's another story of someone who doesn't see his own sexuality in the community around him and then finds a home in Facebook, I think. Tell us a little bit about that.
About this, well, my book is called Misfits because I never feel at home. Like, to me, I know that home is not the house. And what is it then? It's not a community. So if you just look at me from surface, you're reading me as I'm gender non-conforming, but you're reading me probably as a male. You're reading me as a brown person. You're reading me as a colored person here. You're reading me as all these sorts of things, and so you assume that I belong to those communities, or like I would think that I should feel comfortable with a brown community, or with a queer community, or with men, or with gender non-conforming people, but no, I don't. Is the truth of the matter? Like, I don't feel at home in these communities that I should belong to, and that is fine. That's fine. I've tried my whole life to belong to. So even in those in those misfit communities, I don't fit in. But I had tried my whole life as a child to find a home with the straight people, with the boys, with the gender conforming people, with what people expected somebody like me, who looks like me, should be. And that didn't work, and then I looked for home in the periphery, in the margins. I didn't find home there, and the only place I could find home was in myself, And so my whole thing is about, it's possible to find that home that we are all looking for, and it's not out here, it's in here,
So give us tell us an example of where social media allowed someone to find home.
So social media, so suddenly the world is now bigger, right? I can be sitting in my room, feeling quite isolated in Ocean View, a small town on the other side of the mountain, but I'm still feeling connected to the world at large, which I didn't feel before. So now I'm seeing all these other people who have different bodies. So let me talk specifically about this story called Patty. It's a woman who is heavy set, and she has body issues. She's always had body issues, and she's been quite violent with people who bring it up. And because of seeing other bodies on social media, she made a deliberate choice on TikTok to find accounts of bigger-bodied people all over the world who are proud, who are wearing skimpy outfits, who are roller skating in their bathers along the beach. And so initially she says, as she's watching it, she's like, no, but that's wrong. Why are you doing this? You're not supposed to do this. You're not supposed to show this. But she forces herself to watch it and to follow these accounts. And very quickly, her mind rewires, her brain rewires, and she starts seeing these bodies as beautiful because she hasn't seen them in the media before. She's only seeing them now in social media, and she's seeing them in the mirror. So now she's going, oh, but if you're saying you're beautiful, and she's reading all these comments and all these likes saying, wow, you're beautiful. Suddenly, she changed her own perception of her own body, and then I saw her at the beach in her own bather, standing on a rock, and of course, everyone else, or lots of people on the beach are giving her a fail cake, they are saying you're not supposed to look like that, and she, at the end, she, smacks her belly 3 times and shakes her fat at me, from the side there. So completely proud because of how social media and just seeing bodies, just seeing the other, and sort of literally rewires your brain, rewired her brain, and I think it could work for all of us. So just be more deliberate in who you choose to follow on social media, what they look like, what they're doing. Don't just follow people who look like you, please. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can just make a comment as well, is that this idea of beauty, of course, and what is beautiful and how we represent ourselves does bring up some kind of issues close to home as well. The issue around hair, and we know the hair politics in schools and the like. So there's, on the one hand, how we frame what is beautiful, what's not beautiful, how we define what is beautiful can be very different. Yeah. But in addition to that, certainly my personal experience as a person coming from Athlone, now Simon's your neighbor.
Oh, hello.
is that
Give a lift down,
one has to have certainly you have an identity that's at home. Let's say in the house, shall we say? You have identity go to work or the friends play, and one ends up having multiple identities in this complexity. And so often the semiotics of that identity plays out in how we dress, in how we present ourselves to the other as well. So the complexity isn't only, if I may kind of come to the defense of the audience, is not only in how the audience reads you, but how you present yourself to the audience. And we do that instinctively. The fact that I wear jeans and a yellow jacket or whatever the case is clearly a choice, whether it's consciously or not. So it does bring maybe, what you're saying is there's kind of layers to how we're seen and othering as part of that process, but also how we try and fit in, you know, and we kind of present ourselves in multiple ways. There's an academic term which I used to know. If it comes back to me, I will. So it's double consciousness. That's the term. Double consciousness is where you find this way to, and of particular interest, of course, is the black skin in white spaces, where this becomes quite an evident thing.
Yeah, you know, when you've grown up in a society where for decades and decades a white aesthetic has been upheld as the benchmark and everything else is less than. There's an interesting framing around, you know, even the term white and non-white is problematic, the same way, you know, when we talk about our relationship with nature, to talk about ourselves as human and non-human or other than human is problematic because it centers the human or it centers the white person as the central point against which everything else is referenced. And we have to also completely turn that on its head. So now that we have, in Africa, we're going to have almost 50% of our populations are going to be urbanized. Obviously, because of our migration history, whether it's forced upon us because of the state's legislation, etc., we have a very migrant continent. If we're talking about land, connection with land, identity, connection with nature, when most of us are now going to be living in cities, what does that look like?
For me, within the South African context, even as we talk about migration and densification, we have a very unique situation where even within that, there is still othering. And what do I mean by that? You look at where municipalities are choosing to build, say, RDP housing. They're still going to the outskirts. They're still going further and further away from where economic opportunities are happening. So even within that migration, you still find that poor black people, especially women, are still being thrust into the peripheries. And you ask an interesting question about if we are all going to now move towards cities. I don't think we're moving towards cities for the sake of it. I think we're moving towards cities because of economic opportunities, employment opportunities, and so forth. But we have to imagine that because there's such little space and the land is not going to get bigger than it is, right? I don't think we have actually done the mental shift that says, I mean, I live in suburbia right now. I don't think we've done the mental shift that says, will there ever come a point in time where we need to close off our swimming pools so that there can be enough spaces or flats or whatever where your helper's children can live with you and your helper can live with you and your children and your helper's children are able to access the same schools, facilities, hospitals. I came across an interesting concept when we were, as I did work as part of the presidential panel. I think it'd be more, Khalid, you'll be obviously more au fait with it because of your profession, which is NIMBism. And that is an acronym for not in my backyard. So we can all be, you know, liberal and pragmatic and speak of, yes, you know, there must be opportunities for everybody, but there is still this fear and distaste for poor people that, yes, we can have these conversations here at this theater, but as long as I don't see them, as long as they're not within, you know, my eye shots. I don't come from Cape Town, I come from Johannesburg. So driving here in the Uber, I mean, it was just so glaring to me the bodies of people that are just sleeping on the street in this weather. And we've become so blinded and maybe even oblivious to this, that we're also, even as we sit in these spaces, we don't think about, well, what can I do? You know, what can I do within my own setting to say, we must actually open spaces so we can all exist in the same space. Not let's find land solutions where poor people can be unseen somewhere in the corner. So I think even as we think about what cities must look like, we're not thinking about what can I do or what does it mean for my life. I think we're thinking, how can government make it go away or make them go away?
I think, you know, some of the sort of sustainability talk around what the future city looks like is that it becomes these clusters of small-scale walkable distances. Yeah. So where you have families from across income brackets, but where everyone's living within walking distance of the school and the grocery store and the I don't know how one takes a city that's built around long-haul transport and private cars to do that. Khalid, do you have any thoughts? I mean, you've done a fair amount of work in informal settlements to try and address this.
This is my thing.
This is your thing.
Because if I can take the chance just to frame the problem a bit more broadly, in a sense, right? So we've got, let's say, three major forces that is shaping the making of a city. The one is what you talk about, the rural-urban migration. And across Africa, we know that we're facing a major problem in the speed of urbanization, which is unprecedented. So currently, Africa is less than 50% urbanized, as you mentioned, but it will become up to 80% urbanized. In South Africa, we already more than 50% urbanized. We're about 62, 65% urbanized already. And the expectation is that by 2050, we'll be more than 80% urbanized. And that is discounting in-migration of people. One problem, right? It's not necessarily the fact of urbanization, but the speed of urbanization, which is a problem. The second problem is the huge discrepancy between those who have and don't. And there's a measure for this, the Gini coefficient between the highest income earners and the lowest income earners in the country. And we're one of the most unequal cities in the world. Our Gini coefficient is 67 point something, which makes us, if not the most unequal, amongst the most unequal countries in the world. Then added to that, you have a problem of joblessness. And of course, COVID has exacerbated that. And we see our youth unemployment is more than 70% unemployed. And, but our general measure of unemployment, and we're probably about 35% unemployed at the moment, is measured based on the people looking for a job. It discounts the people who have given up looking for a job. In which case, if you add that, we're probably close to half our population that doesn't have a job. So the net effect of the three forces, and there may be plenty of others, of course, is that we caught up in a dynamics of creating slums. And it's a self-fulfilling narrative. If people don't have money, they can't pay the rates and taxes, which means they don't get services, which means you know, they're kind of excluded, left in the margins, and the circle goes around. We're trapped in a cycle of poverty and homelessness. And we clearly at a loss for how to tackle this. And one of the big problems is who has the ability to negotiate access to service and resources. Now, the wealthy people of this world come and employ me and say, please change the rules so that I can get an extra house or extra room or whatever. I'm there to negotiate the rules with the municipality on behalf of a client. Whereas people who don't have access to power are left to survive in the margins. So what you see, Bulelwa, are those people who can't access power. And they're left to fend for themselves, and they then tend to negotiate the rules differently to how, let's say, people employ me to do. So if you're asking me about the future of the city, if we aren't able to renegotiate how people find place in our cities, they will make the city themselves. Yeah? And that's the big challenge in terms of how the city manages the process of making the city versus the other forces in finding their space.
Just the sheer force of economics. You've got these wealthy, locked-in middle-class suburbs. You've got these sort of labor communities, and then you've got informal settlements. And it's impossible to have any upward mobility if you can never get into that property market. But Chase, this brings me to you. In terms of the apartheid nature of the city, has created the very cultural enclave that has allowed something like Kaaps to thrive and to stay protected. Now, we imagine ourselves into a hypothetical future city where we have these, because in Cape Town, the race and the economics are parallel. So you have mostly white communities here, mostly dark communities there. If one were to mix them up socially and culturally and economically so that we had a more representative community, what would that mean for a little cultural enclave that is where Kaaps can thrive?
What would it mean if the communities became more diverse?
Yeah.
Oh God, I don't know. Oh my God, I can't even imagine it. Because my whole life, it's been like I live in two separate worlds. As a baby, as a kid, I'm growing up in this community, and I go to school at 5 years old in the white community. So at 5, I realized I have to, in my book I say, split myself in two. I have to learn how to speak like this in the white spaces and how to not code switch. I had to learn how to do all these different things because of these two different worlds. So really, to me, it's two different worlds, and I can't even imagine what it would look like for those worlds to properly mix, to actually genuinely mix. I can't see it. I'm sorry. I can't see it. But what I would say, what would be beneficial is if people listen. Can I just say that when I was asked to do this panel, I thought I shouldn't be here because what do I know about in my community about climate and environment and nature? Not realizing that because it's so innate in us already, these natural things, right? Like recycling, we get experts who are telling us, oh, you're littering and this is how you recycle. But my opa has always, and my oma has always been using the plastic sake from Pick n Pay for hair, to wrap the hair around, as the bin, for years. And like the grapevine in our yard came from a pip from my opa's father, So like we've always been like connected to nature, reusing. And it's a return. So if we mix, we need to go back to those old things that we don't recognize that this is what we're doing in our communities already, right? In these small spaces, we don't value it. I see it and I write about it so that hopefully you can see it too, But it's not about future. It's almost about looking back. What did my opa do that I can still do today? They had the key. Yeah.
I'd like to comment on that too, because I think I address that not in the way that you asked the question, to say, and for me, how I would contribute to the discussion is to say, Black people have always learned how to assimilate into white culture and Western culture, but for me, the mixing that needs to happen is the fact that whiteness has so much to learn from how Black people have learned to survive along nature. And I think in the book I address how the attachment to the land, for example, with my grandparents, was that we grew up knowing that food comes from the ground. Now we've got issues with obesity and MSG and all of that. And I learned to access a pediatrician. I don't even think I've been to a pediatrician because my grandmother had remedies and herbs that she used that came from the ground that, that raised us. And so I think that actually we can reimagine a more diverse and a mixing, and there would be so many learnings from African culture that are so important for the globe, not just for other South Africans, about sustainability, about the fact that we can share resources, about the fact that you don't need to be you know, the notion of, you know, one winner takes all, or you eat for the kill. We don't know that, because we know a system of life where resources are shared, and everyone can shine. So we don't compete with one another as humans. And actually, nature is part and parcel of who we are.
Yeah.
So that's what I would imagine would happen with the mixing, away from the assimilation that we've come to know as well. Let me speak to myself as a black woman who has, you know, dwelled in white-dominated spaces and a profession.
You know, what comes through so beautifully, both in Amitav Ghosh's book, Nutmeg's Curse, and Jeremy Lent's The Patterning Instinct, is that they remind us that the connection with land and the connection with nature and the partness of nature that you are reflecting on now, is that every one of us, if you trace our culture far enough back, we go to the same animist roots, every one of us. It's just in certain parts of the globe that we have now separated ourselves from that. So the echoes of that way are still present in so many indigenous communities around the world, if we can just tap into that and get this kind of Western materialist view off the pedestal that it's been holding for so long. We have 9 minutes left. So we would love to hear from the floor. If anyone has some questions, we've got a roving mic. There's a question right down here at the front. If someone could trot down the stairs, thank you. And is it possible to soften the lights a little bit?
Or up the house lights so we can see.
Yeah. I think the lights is here. Oh, yes, the lights is the back, okay. Thanks.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
I have a question for Bulelwa, but before I ask it, I just like to contextualize it. So I grew up in El Dorado Park, which is also the birth child of a forced removal. And one thing that struck me was when you spoke about how the moment you move to the suburbs, you see the trees. And it is something that when I eventually now as an adult had to go and look for a home, it's the thing that made me not live in the township, was because I wanted my son to grow up in an area where there is trees and where there is birds and, you know, hadidas, as annoying as they are. I too wanted a hadida. I wanted to complain about hadidas as well, you know. So my question then is, do you think we'll ever get to a place where we start bringing nature back into the townships? Because I think we know the history of why the townships do not have trees. Mostly for surveillance, because it's easy to fly a helicopter over a treeless place. And I think, this might not be true, but I think there was like a very softer ulterior motive of like, let's deprive these assholes of oxygen. So, you know, but that's my own conspiracy theory. But do you think there'll ever be this time where township kids can also experience trees and shrubbery and hadidas and proper nature?
It's a very interesting question, because you know, when I grew up at home in Meadowlands, we had, as I said, vegetable gardens, apricot trees, grapes, you name it. It was all there, and a lawn. But that question is actually linked with what Khalid was saying and what Leonie was speaking about urban migration. So the reason that those trees had to be cut down was because suddenly there was this interest and this influx of people from the rural areas, even some of the neighboring African countries. So then the trees were cut down to make space for back rooms. And back rooms meant that people could charge extra income. And then also now in the post-democratic era, then you have, you know, the Pakistani business people, and the Sowetans, the original Sowetans, charging them rental space, rentals, so that they can run those shops. So it's a survival issue, and it's a socio-economic issue more than anything. I don't think that it's about, you know, not wanting to see birds or whatever, but I think as long as we don't have proper solutions to the migration issues. And as Khalid was saying, people are going to find options that work for them to solve their own problems. So that's one thing. And also remember, the location of where the townships are was also it was deliberate. You know, that's where the mine dumps were and so forth. And you could actually even argue that those were not spaces that that were, you know, kind of ideal for human occupation. I remember once, and I thought, you know, my husband and I thought we were doing our children, you know, it was a great lesson in education. We left our suburban home and we drove to Soweto and we drove around and we said, look, this is where I grew up, this is Meadowlands. And, you know, my husband said, this is Shaweland. And I remember our daughter, she's sitting up there, she said, and she was 6 years old, and she said to us, this is all wonderful, but is this the life that you want for me? So that was like a very unexpected answer, but what she was saying is, don't romanticize these concentration camps that were not made to, for us to access the best that we could, because they are far away from activities. They are prone to pollution because they've got mine dumps around them. So, you know, in one hand, I understand what you're saying about how can we make our townships as livable as possible, but on the other, how then do we make everyone else feel like they are a legitimate citizen that belongs in the country where they are living, you know, within and around economic activities? So it's the same question that you were asking, I think, to Trace when you said, what's going to happen to the Kapsa language if now there's all of this? So I'm in two minds about that question around pride about spaces that were never formed for us to thrive, but we survived in, and on the one hand, or reforming our country so that we can, you know, we can all live in diversity.
So we're really running out of time. So I want to quickly gallop the mic to the next question. Is there a hand up somewhere? But I also feel there's a point of urgency around what you've raised around greenery and trees in cities. You know, if you look at Europe, what happened across European cities recently with these terrible heat waves, it's a reminder that this is the kind of, these climate shocks are coming at us hard and fast. And the only way that we can properly buffer ourselves against the extremes of those events is to have greenery and vegetation and trees in our cities. I mean, any green space, whether it's a little wetland, a little green field, little copse of trees, provides an airbag against those, you know, whether it's extreme heat, extreme wind, and extreme fire, extreme flooding. So we need to be, as a point of absolute urgency, we have to be planting lots and lots of trees now, particularly in those communities that don't have them. Otherwise, you're going to have people sitting dying of heat stroke in poorly insulated buildings soon. I mean, this is a point of absolute urgency, and we have to find a way as communities, as cities, to be really politically active around this, to get trees into neighborhoods. That's my little point of activism for the day.
If I can kind of add to your story there, because obviously the story from an urban design point of view is a bit more complex in the sense that modernism was, certainly in the planning point, was about the separation of function, right? To keep the factories away from people, healthy, etc. And suburbia was meant to represent the rural. So you have space to plant trees, etc. And obviously a lot of that is lost. But the model of modernism, unfortunately, is very unsustainable. Suburbia is one of the most unsustainable models of making cities we have. And if the last point I want to make is that ecological systems is great if you can do localized micro kind of interventions, but where it is most impactful is to imagine the ecological system at the scale of the city, because those systems are the system that gets wiped out by suburbia. So we actually need density. We can't expand our city endlessly and occupy unoccupied bits of land. And we need to do density alongside and parallel with the ecological systems. And it's entirely achievable and possible.
It absolutely is. I am really sorry about this, but we are going to have to wrap it up because we are being governed by very strict rules around here around timekeeping. So I just want to thank all of the panelists for their fantastic contribution. Please join them downstairs for book signing, and thank you for coming today.